Hello there, Drew Hanish of Whiskey Lore, and time for another whiskey tasting. Today I am going to be talking about a whiskey that I have not talked about for a while. It is a whiskey that recently I was listening back to one of my old interviews, and I talked about the fact that Laphroaig was my favorite Scotch whiskey. Well, a lot of time has passed since that episode, 3 years in fact, and so sometimes you got to check yourself and say, is it still my favorite? Or is it kind of sliding down the scale? I will tell you that for a short time it was sliding down the scale, but when I went back and did a tasting on it the other day, it was like coming home. And I started thinking about whiskey versus beer and my experience with whiskey versus beer. And beer, I drank beer for a lot of years and was not drinking whiskey, and then kind of got into wine for a little while before I got into whiskey. And I would go through these experimental phases for a long time with beer. And so I would try anything. I just wanted to understand the flavor of beer and would kind of seek things out and figure out what I liked and what I didn't like. And I started, like everybody does, with lighter beers, and then I slowly started working my way up until I got to Guinness. And once I got to Guinness, it was interesting because all of a sudden it was like I was comparing everything to Guinness, whether it was a stout or a porter, or even if it was a pilsner. It was my experience where I would say, how do I feel? Do I feel better because I'm sitting here drinking this Guinness, or would I rather be experimenting still and trying to find something else? So there became a point where I just stopped experimenting and I said, that's it. I'm a Guinness drinker. I occasionally will have a Franz and Connor kind of moment, and I'm just interested in having a wheated beer or something that's got kind of that German bite to it, the hops bite to it. I never get into sour beers. I've never gotten into sour beers, but I do like some Belgian beers, and I tend to, again, occasionally find myself in the mood for this or that. But I did seem to be graduating to more darker, robust kind of flavors, because I remember even when I was drinking mainstream beers, I was, besides Guinness, I was drinking Beck's Dark. So, and even today, if I go to a Mexican restaurant, I'm going to order a Dos Equis Amber because it's a really nice, heavy beer that goes really well with that experience. But still, if you press me, I am going to get myself a Guinness, and I will thoroughly enjoy it. So, what about whiskey? Am I going through that same sort of thing with whiskey? When you start out and you're drinking stuff that, first time I had a Isla whiskey, I was like, oh, what is that? And it just wasn't hitting me right. And so then I worked my way around and I was drinking a bunch of different stuff. And then I slowly found my love for Isla whiskey and even for the iodine note, although I will admit I am still probably more on the briny side. I like that kind of barbecue note that comes in on these whiskeys more so, and kind of the sea character more than I am the iodine note. That's okay as long as it's not like overdone in a whiskey, that it's just kind of a small element of it. So the idea that Laphroaig is a whiskey that I gravitate to, it does have a little bit of that iodine note to it, but it's subtle enough for me that it's probably at the max of what I would enjoy, and it just adds to the personality of this particular whiskey. So probably about 2 years ago, I fell in love with Kilchoman Sonic. It was a moment that changed how I tasted whiskey, because I realized that now I could have the peat, but I could also have the sherry. And so it kind of brought me away from Laphroaig. And the only thing that Laphroaig was really giving me at that point was the PX cask, which was a cask strength version of their Carchus line, which was amazing, absolutely amazing, but I could never find a bottle of it. So it was like, I can't buy that. And then they came out with their sherry cask version, which was widely available, and I just didn't like it. It wasn't actually, to me, a nice blend of the two. It felt sort of like they were disconnected. And so I was then into Ben Romick. That's when I fell in love with Ben Romick, because Ben Romick brings us some of that character. It is a Speyside whiskey, and so it is not going to be overly heavy on the smoke, but the smoke is just this really entertaining piece of the tasting experience for me. So Laphroaig has been sitting in my cabinet, but it's just not been getting bothered. So in a way, you could say, okay, maybe it's not my Guinness of whiskeys. But then the other day I said, well, let me just kind of pull it out and see, because it's been sitting there and I haven't really given it much attention here lately, and maybe I should. And then I put my nose to it, and the memory of how much I love this whiskey came back. And this is just a 10-year-old. This is not the cask strength 10. I love the cask strength 10 probably more than this. But this, mainly because the earthiness really starts to come out in some of those versions. But this is the more consistent version versus the cask strength, which year to year will be a little bit different because of the barrels and the way it ages and the weather and all the rest. So, but I did a little experiment. I jumped on AI, and I was kind of interested to see what AI would say if I said, what is the difference between Laphroaig 10 and, say, Lagavulin 8? Because I could say 16, but 16 is subtle, and I don't like longer aged peated whiskeys that much. I think it is a very competent whiskey, but as a peat fan, it doesn't excite me that much. So I thought, well, let me measure it next to the 8. I loved the 9 when they came out with Lagavulin 9. And the 12 was exceptional too, the version that I had. But the 8 is a little bit harsher to me. And while that's fine, I can get through it, it's not like the comfort that I feel when I drink the Laphroaig. So AI, I said, what is the difference between these two? What is the personality difference between these two whiskeys? And AI's response was that Laphroaig is not for the starter, and Lagavulin 8 is, and Lagavulin 8 is less smoky and more fruit forward, whereas this is much more briny and is going to bring hints of seaweed. It's going to bring that sea character, it's going to bring the iodine, and it's going to bring the heavy smoke. Honestly, though, I disagree with AI a lot. I have had my argument. I actually got angry at AI the other day because I was asking it for things, and it was so blatantly wrong on what it was sending me back that I was like, come on, dude, give me something better. Or I think we'll be able to pick out patterns of what is coming from AI, because AI really does have a limited vocabulary, so it tends to use the same phrasing over and over and over again. But the Laphroaig, I was just sitting there, I was thinking, its opinion of it being too smoky and too aggressive, I disagree. This is where critical thinking comes in and creativity, where AI is not going to be able to handle that. Where I'm saying, look, I could turn bourbon fans into drinkers of Laphroaig, I believe, because I can turn them into fans of Port Charlotte. And the reason I can turn them into fans of Port Charlotte is because I can introduce them to the barbecue note, and that smoke then becomes part of that experience. This is a little harder, granted. They have to sort of like that. It's going away from the barbecue and more towards a seafood umami kind of a character. But honestly, if you introduce people to the umami side, and hopefully they've tried some whiskey that's had a little iodine in it before, I think people would really warm to this whiskey and they would become fans of it. I think the reason people hate it when they first taste it is because they haven't been properly prepared to drink it. As for me, is it my favorite whiskey? And this isn't just Scotch. Actually, I'm going to say it is my overall favorite whiskey. It is coming home for me. It is the whiskey that I first will say that I truly fell in love with, and you never forget your first. And this was the one that really just hit it for me. And whenever I put it to my nose and whenever I taste it, I get a nice warm feeling over me. and there is nothing any other whiskey can do. The other ones will turn my head. They will definitely turn my head. But this is the one that is, it's not necessarily, as I started out talking about Guinness, the thing about Guinness is that I want a Guinness and I really don't want any other beer. But if you give me another beer, I have to choose something different because they don't sell Guinness at Mexican restaurants. And actually, probably a good thing. But, it's something where I could just be happy drinking Guinness for the rest of my life. Laphroaig, I'm sorry, but I do want to play the field. I want to try different whiskeys because whiskey is so absolutely fascinating. And I want to continue to explore this idea of terroir, this idea of, what are you finishing these whiskeys in? What is the character of the place that this whiskey is coming from? What is the distiller's magic that makes this whiskey different from other whiskeys? That curiosity is still as strong as ever. But I will tell you that when I need to ground myself, I will have myself a bottle of Laphroaig and pour myself a nice little glass of it. What is your go-to whiskey? What is that whiskey that you are just in love with? And do you ever think there'd be a whiskey that would turn your head so much that you would just give up ever really wanting to taste any other whiskeys? It's an interesting question, and definitely one worth exploring. Until next time, cheers and Slainte. Don't start with a cast drink. Nope. Something about it. Get something nice out of those Maker's Mark casks as well. Nicely done.